She saw how they avoided looking back, how they pulled their coats tighter as if the cold came from the twins themselves rather than from the gray November sky. Maren began to cry. She cried quietly, the way she always cried, as if she was afraid her tears might disturb someone. Sina put an arm around her sister and held her while the gravediggers finished their work, while the last of the townspeople disappeared down the mountain road, while the snow thickened and the light began to fade. They stood there until the grave was a mound of frozen earth, indistinguishable from the others in the small cemetery. Then Sina turned her sister toward home, and they began the long walk back. The cabin appeared through the trees like a wound in the forest. Even from a distance, Sina could see the problems. The roof sagged on the eastern side where years of snow had accumulated beyond its capacity to bear. Gaps showed between the logs where the chinking had cracked and fallen away. The chimney tilted slightly, evidence of a slow collapse that had been happening for years, but that no one had ever fixed. This was the house their father had built when he first came to Colorado from Minnesota, bringing his young bride and his dreams of silver wealth. He had been a farmer, not a carpenter. He had done his best, but his best had not been good enough. The wind found every weakness in that cabin. It crept through the gaps in the walls and whistled under the door, and turned every night into a battle against cold that could never quite be won. Their mother had stuffed rags into the cracks and hung quilts over the windows and kept the fire burning constantly. But it was never enough. It was never enough. Sina pushed open the door and stepped inside. The temperature in the cabin was perhaps 5 degrees warmer than outside. Her breath still formed small clouds that drifted in the still air. The water bucket by the stove had a skin of ice across its surface. Thin but present, proof that even with a fire burning, this house could not keep winter out. This was the house that had killed their mother. Not directly, not with violence, but with the slow, patient cruelty of cold that seeps through walls, that steals heat faster than any fire can replace it, that turns sleep into a dangerous gamble. Their mother had fought that cold for 19 years, and in the end, the cold had won. Sina knelt by the stove and began feeding it wood. The flames caught and grew, but she knew from bitter experience that it would take hours before the cabin felt anything close to comfortable. And by midnight, when the fire burned low, the cold would creep back in again. Maren sat on the edge of their parents' bed. She had not spoken since the funeral. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, her hands folded in her lap like a woman 3 times her age. Sina looked at her twin and felt something crack inside her chest. They were the same age, born on the same day, but they had never been the same. Sina was taller by 2 inches, broader in the shoulders, stronger in the arms. She had inherited their father's stubborn jaw and their grandfather's sharp eyes. She was the one who split wood and hauled water and made decisions when decisions needed to be made. Maren was smaller, softer, more delicate. She had inherited their mother's gentle face and their grandmother's artistic hands. She was the one who sewed and cooked and drew pictures in the margins of books, creating small worlds of beauty in the midst of hardship. They complemented each other. They always had. But now, looking at her sister's broken expression, Sina wondered if complementing each other would be enough. 2 young women could not survive alone on a mountain homestead. Everyone said so. It was simply the way of things. At the door, a presence waited. Fenrir stood motionless in the doorway, his gray and silver fur dusted with snow, his ancient eyes watching the sisters with patient understanding. He was a wolf hybrid, raised from a pup by their father 12 years ago. A Norwegian trapper who had known their grandfather had given the pup to Gunnar, saying the animal carried the spirit of the mountains. Their father had kept Fenrir in memory of the old ways, even though he had refused to follow those ways himself. Now the wolf dog was old, his muzzle white, his movements slow and careful. But his eyes held wisdom that seemed to span generations, and when he looked at Sina, she felt somehow less alone. Fenrir crossed the cold cabin floor and lay down at Maren's feet. He rested his grizzled head on his paws and did not move, offering the only comfort he could give. The knock came 2 days later. Sina opened the door to find Jedediah Carver standing on the porch, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his silver watch chain gleaming against his dark vest. He was 54 years old, the owner of the largest silver mine in the region, and the richest man within 50 miles. He had not attended the funeral, but he had come now. Sina stepped aside to let him enter, though every instinct told her to slam the door in his face. Carver was not a man people refused. His mind employed half the men in Silver Creek. His money had built the church, the school, the general store. When Jedediah Carver wanted something, Jedediah Carver usually got it, and Cena was beginning to understand what he wanted. Carver surveyed the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. She knew what he saw: the gaps in the walls, the frost on the windows, the pathetic fire struggling against the impossible cold. He saw weakness. He saw opportunity. He saw prey. "I came to pay my respects," he said, his voice smooth as polished silver, "and to discuss practical matters." Maren rose from the bed and moved to stand beside her sister. Together, the twins faced the man who had come to pick over their parents' remains. "What practical matters?" Cena asked. Carver smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for everyone else to realize it. "This land," he said, "this cabin. Two young women cannot maintain a homestead alone. It is not the natural order of things." He paused, letting the words settle like snow on frozen ground. "I am prepared to make you a fair offer. Enough money to relocate to Denver, perhaps, or even San Francisco. Enough to start fresh somewhere more suitable for ladies of your situation." "Our situation," Cena repeated flatly. "Orphaned, unmarried, without male protection." Carver spread his hands as if these facts were self-evident and inarguable. "The winter alone will be difficult enough, and the winters here are not kind to the unprepared." Maren's hand found Cena's. The younger twins' fingers were cold, trembling slightly. Cena thought about what Carver was really asking. He did not want the cabin. The cabin was worthless. He wanted the land. This particular piece of mountain that their grandfather had claimed 30 years ago, that their father had inherited, that now belonged to them. Why did he want it so badly? "We will manage," Cena said. Carver's smile flickered. Just for a moment, something harder showed beneath the polished surface. Something cold and calculating, and entirely without mercy. "I would hate to see two young women suffer needlessly," he said. "The offer stands. For now." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "I should mention that I have been speaking with Judge Whitmore about the legal status of this property. Two women without male guardianship." He shook his head with theatrical sadness. "There are questions, complications. It would be so much simpler if you simply accepted my generous offer." He left without waiting for a response. Cena stood at the window, watching his dark figure disappear into the snow. Beside her, Maren finally spoke. "He wants to take everything," she whispered. "Yes." "Can he?" Cena did not answer. She did not know. But she was beginning to suspect that Jedediah Carver had reasons for wanting their land that went far beyond simple greed. That night, after Maren had cried herself to sleep, Cena sat alone by the dying fire and thought about her father. Gunnar Halvorson had been a proud man. Too proud, perhaps. He had come to Colorado with dreams of silver wealth, but the silver had eluded him. He had worked in other men's mines, including Carver's, saving money year by year, always believing that someday he would strike it rich on his own land. He never did. But he had kept one thing from his own father. One thing he had never sold, never traded, never mentioned to anyone outside the family. Cena rose from her chair and crossed to the corner of the cabin where her father's tool chest sat. It was a heavy oak box, scarred by decades of use, brought all the way from Norway by her grandfather Eric before Cena was born. She had not opened it since her father's death. She had not been able to bear it. Now she knelt before it and lifted the lid. The smell of oil and sawdust rose to meet her. Her father's tools lay neatly arranged, each in its proper place. Hammers, chisels, planes, saws. The implements of a craftsman, though her father had never quite mastered the craft. But beneath the tools, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was something else entirely. Cena lifted it carefully. The oilcloth fell away, revealing a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed but intact. Her grandfather's journal. She had seen it only once before, when she was 9 years old. Her grandfather Eric had shown it to her, turning the pages slowly, explaining the drawings in his rough, accented English. "In Norway," he had said, "we do not build houses on the mountain. We build houses in the mountain. The Earth stays the same temperature, summer and winter, 54 degrees always. The mountain protects. She had not understood then. She had been 9 years old, more interested in playing than in listening to an old man's stories about the country he had left behind. She had nodded and smiled and promptly forgotten everything he said. But now, sitting in a cabin that could not keep her warm, facing a winter that might kill her, she opened the journal and began to read. The drawings took her breath away. Page after page of careful sketches filled the yellowed paper. Houses built into hillsides, homes nestled in natural caves, dwellings that used the earth itself as insulation against the killing cold. Her grandfather had studied these techniques for decades, had refined them, had dreamed of building one himself in this new country. And then she turned to a page that made her heart stop beating. It was a map, rough but detailed, and unmistakably it showed the land around her father's homestead. Her grandfather had been here, had walked this land with a builder's eyes, had surveyed it looking for possibilities that others could not see. A small X marked a spot perhaps 2 miles up the mountain, behind a massive granite boulder that Sina recognized from her childhood explorations. Beside the X, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were words in Norwegian. Perfect Louis. Når du trenger det, vil det være der. Perfect shelter. When you need it, it will be there. Sina's hands trembled as she turned the page. More drawings appeared. A cave entrance, wide and tall, facing southeast to catch the morning sun. Measurements in meters, converted to feet in a different colored ink, added later. Notes about the angle of the opening, the direction it faced, the depth of the chamber beyond. And then a final drawing that made everything clear. A house, built inside the cave. Wooden walls closing off the entrance to create rooms. A stone fireplace positioned against the cave wall, using a natural gap in the rock as a chimney. A sleeping loft constructed where the ceiling rose highest. Windows set into the wooden front wall to let in light. Her grandfather had designed it all. Every detail, every measurement, every element needed to turn a natural cave into a home that the mountain itself would protect from winter's worst fury. He had found the perfect shelter, and he had never built it. Sina flipped back through the journal, searching for an explanation. She found it in an entry dated 1868, the year her father had taken over the homestead after Eric grew too old to work. Gunnar refuses to listen. He says the old ways are for peasants, that Americans build proper houses above ground like civilized people. He is ashamed of where we came from. He does not understand that the old ways survive because they work. I have shown him the cave. I have explained everything. He laughed at me. The entry continued in a shakier hand, written perhaps years later, when Eric's strength was failing. If my son will not build what I have designed, perhaps my grandchildren will. I leave this journal for whoever needs it. The cave is there. The knowledge is here. When the time comes, someone will understand. Sina closed the journal and held it against her chest. Her father had known. He had known there was a better way, a safer way, a way to survive winters that killed other families in their inadequate cabins, and he had rejected it out of pride, out of shame for his immigrant roots, out of a desperate need to be American, to build American, to prove that he had left the old country behind forever. And now he lay in frozen ground, killed by the house he had insisted on building. But the cave was still there. The knowledge was still here. And Sina finally understood what her grandfather had been trying to tell her all those years ago. She tucked the journal inside her coat and looked toward the bed where Maren slept. Her sister's face was peaceful in sleep, free for a few hours from grief and fear and uncertainty. Tomorrow Sina would tell her about the journal. Tomorrow everything would change. But first she needed to find the cave herself. She needed to know if her grandfather's dreams were real or just the fantasies of an old man who never stopped longing for home. She needed to know if there was any hope at all. Now let me ask you something. What would you do in Sina's position? You have just buried your parents. You are alone in a cabin that cannot keep you warm. Everyone expects you to fail. The richest man in the county wants to take your land, and the whole town thinks you are cursed. But you have a journal. You have a map. You have knowledge passed down from your grandfather, tested by generations of Norwegian winters far harsher than anything Colorado could produce. Would you trust it? Would you climb that mountain searching for a cave that might not exist? Would you risk everything on the hope that the old ways still work? Think about that as you continue watching, because what Sina found on that mountain would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had ever laughed at her, doubted her, or tried to destroy her. The mountain was waiting, and it had been waiting for a very long time. Sina left before dawn the next morning. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world wrapped in white silence. She dressed in her warmest clothes, packed food for the day, and took the journal with its precious map. Fenrir was waiting at the door. The old wolf dog rose stiffly from his spot on the cold floor, his ancient eyes bright with something that looked almost like anticipation. He knew she was going somewhere important. He could sense it the way animals sense things that humans cannot explain. "You should stay," Sina told him. "Rest by the fire where it is warm." Fenrir ignored her completely, as he always did when he had made up his mind about something. He walked through the open door and stood in the snow, waiting for her to follow. They climbed together. The map led them up the mountain through pine forests, heavy with new snow, past frozen streams that whispered beneath their ice, past rocky outcroppings that thrust up from the white landscape like the bones of ancient giants. Twice Sina lost her way and had to backtrack, comparing the landmarks around her to the drawings in her grandfather's journal. The snow was deep, sometimes reaching past her knees, and her legs ached with every step. Her lungs burned from the cold air. Her fingers grew numb inside her mittens, but she kept going. Fenrir ranged ahead, his old legs finding strength she had not expected. Despite his age, he moved through the snow with surprising grace, pausing occasionally to look back and make sure she was still following. He seemed to know where they were going, seemed to remember trails he had walked long ago with a different master. 2 hours after leaving the cabin, Sina rounded a massive granite boulder and stopped. The cave was exactly as her grandfather had drawn it. The entrance was perhaps 20 feet wide and 12 feet tall, a dark mouth in the mountainside facing southeast to catch the morning sun. A natural overhang of rock extended above the opening, protecting it from snow and rain. The floor inside was relatively flat, covered in centuries of accumulated dust but completely dry. Sina walked inside. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Outside, the temperature hovered around 15 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside the cave, 20 feet from the entrance, the air was cool but not cold. There was no wind, no dampness, just stable, constant stillness. She walked deeper, 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet. The light from the entrance dimmed to a soft gray glow, but the temperature remained exactly the same. She pressed her palm against the stone wall. It was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was neutral, stable, unchanging. 54 degrees. Just as her grandfather had written, the mountain did not care about the blizzard that had raged 2 days ago. The mountain did not care about the killing cold that waited outside. The mountain maintained its own temperature, steady and unwavering, a refuge from winter's worst fury. Sina ran her hands along the stone walls, smooth in places, rough in others, but solid everywhere. These walls would not leak, would not develop gaps, would not let the wind whisper through in the middle of the night to steal the warmth from sleeping bodies. She turned to look back toward the entrance, where gray daylight filtered in, and Fenrir sat watching her with patient attention. And she could see it, could see exactly what her grandfather had envisioned all those years ago. A wooden wall across the front, with a door and windows to let in light. A floor of planks raised a few inches above the stone to create an insulating air gap. A fireplace built against the side wall where a natural fissure rose toward the surface, creating a perfect natural chimney. A sleeping loft where the ceiling was high enough to stand. A home, protected by the mountain itself. Warm when the world outside was deadly. She could build this. No, they could build this. Together. The next morning, Sina showed Maren the journal. She spread it open on the table, turning the pages slowly, explaining each drawing the way their grandfather had explained them to her so many years ago. She described the cave, the constant temperature, the natural features that made it perfect for their grandfather's design. Maren listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Sina finished, the younger twin did not respond for a long moment. She stared at the drawings, at the careful measurements, at the notes written in Norwegian that she could barely read. "You want us to live in a cave," she said finally, "like animals." "I want us to live," Sina replied. "This cabin is going to kill us, just like it killed Mother. Carver knows it. Everyone in town knows it. They are all waiting for us to freeze or starve or simply give up. And your solution is to become cave dwellers." Marin's voice cracked with something between anger and despair. "Do you have any idea what people already say about us? The cursed twins? The unlucky ones? The girls who brought misfortune to everyone around them. Now you want to give them more reasons to mock us? I do not care what they say." "Well, I care." Marin stood abruptly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I care because I have spent my entire life being whispered about, being avoided in the street, being treated like something is wrong with me, just because I happen to be born at the same time as you." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the fire. "I cannot take any more of it, Sina. I cannot." Sina felt the words like physical blows, but she did not back down. She could not afford to back down. "Then go to Denver," she said quietly. "Take whatever money Carver offers. Find a position as a seamstress or a governess or a household servant. Spend the rest of your life working for people who will never see you as their equal." She paused. "Or stay here with me. Help me build what our grandfather designed. Prove that the old ways work. Prove that we do not need anyone's permission or approval to survive." Marin stared at her sister. The fire crackled in the silence between them. "And if the cave is not what you think, if grandfather's drawings are just the dreams of a homesick old man who never accepted that he had left Norway behind, then we sell the land and go to Denver together." Sina's voice softened slightly. "Give me 1 week. Let me show you the cave. If it is not everything the journal describes, I will admit I was wrong about everything." The silence stretched between them, filled with 19 years of shared history, shared struggle, shared love that went deeper than any disagreement could reach. Finally, Marin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "1 week," she said. "Show me your cave." The next morning, both sisters climbed the mountain together. Fenrir led the way, his old legs more certain now that he knew the path. Marin struggled with the deep snow and the steep grade, but she did not complain. She did not speak at all until they rounded the granite boulder and the cave entrance appeared before them. Then she stopped and stared. Sina watched her sister's face carefully, looking for any sign of what she was thinking. Marin's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise first, then skepticism, then something that might have been the beginning of wonder. Marin walked to the cave entrance and stood there for a long moment, looking at the stone walls, the high ceiling, the smooth floor stretching back into darkness. Then she stepped inside. She walked deeper than Sina had gone the day before, her footsteps echoing slightly in the enclosed space. She pressed her palms against the stone walls the way Sina had done. She looked up at the ceiling, studying the natural formations, the fissures and gaps that her grandfather had noted in his drawings. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The fear was still there, but something else had joined it, something that sounded almost like hope. "It really is warm in here," she said. 54 degrees, year-round summer and winter. That is what grandfather wrote, and that is what I felt when I came here yesterday." Marin was quiet for another long moment. Then she pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, the one she always carried for sketching, and began to draw. Sina watched in surprise as her sister's pencil moved rapidly across the page. Lines appeared, walls, angles, proportions. Marin was not just looking at the cave. She was seeing it the way their grandfather had seen it, understanding the possibilities that the space contained. "If we build the front wall here," Marin said, still drawing, "we can maximize the interior space while keeping the proportions pleasing. The fireplace should go against this wall, where the chimney gap is widest. The sleeping loft needs to be at least 7 feet above the main floor, which means we position it here where the natural ceiling is highest." She looked up at Sina, and for the first time since their parents' deaths, something like light showed in her eyes. "I can design this," she said. "I can design all of it. The layout, the proportions, the flow of the space. You do the building, I do the design. We do it together, as equals." Sina felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "Together," she agreed, "as equals." This was the moment everything truly changed. Not because they had found the cave, not because they had decided to build, because they had found each other again. The cursed twins, the unlucky ones, the girls everyone expected to fail. They had something the whole valley had underestimated: each other. The news reached Silver Creek within a week. The Halverson twins had announced their intention to build a house inside a cave. Not move into the cave like animals, but actually construct a proper dwelling within it, using techniques their Norwegian grandfather had designed decades ago. The reaction was immediate, widespread, and exactly what Sina had expected. At the general store, people gathered in small groups to discuss the scandal. The twins had always been strange, they said, born under a bad sign, marked by misfortune from the moment they drew their first breath. Now they were proving just how unnatural they truly were by choosing to live underground like moles or badgers. Reverend Fletcher delivered a sermon about the dangers of rejecting civilized ways. He spoke of cave dwellers in the Bible, of people who had turned their backs on progress and enlightenment. He did not mention the Halverson sisters by name, but everyone in the congregation knew exactly who he meant. Young men gathered at the saloon to place bets on how long the twins would last. Virgil Crawford, a loud-mouthed 23-year-old who worked at the general store, wagered $20 that they would abandon their foolish project before summer arrived. And Jedediah Carver's reaction was more direct than anyone else's. He rode up to the cave site on a cold Tuesday morning in early December, when the sisters had already begun clearing debris from the cave floor. Sina was hauling rocks to a pile near the entrance. Marin was sketching the interior dimensions for her design plans. Fenrir lay near the entrance, watching everything with patient attention. Carver sat on his horse for a full minute, surveying the scene with undisguised contempt. "Building yourself a grave," he said finally. "That is what people are saying in town. The cursed twins, digging themselves a hole to die in. I must say, I did not expect you to make my job quite so easy." Sina continued hauling rocks. She did not look at him. "I defended you," Carver continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "When people called you unnatural, I said you were simply young and foolish, that you would come to your senses when you realized how difficult survival would be. Now I see they were right about you all along." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes cold and calculating. "That cave will collapse when the spring rains come, or freeze you solid when your pathetic little fire cannot keep up with a real winter storm, or simply drive you mad with the darkness and the silence and the knowledge that you are living like animals while decent people sleep in proper homes." Sina set down her rock and turned to face him. "Is that why you want our land so badly?" she asked. "Because you think we are going to die and leave it unoccupied for you to claim?" Something flickered in Carver's eyes, just for a moment, before the mask of benevolent concern slipped back into place. "I want to help you," he said smoothly. "My offer still stands. Sell me the land for a fair price, take the money, start a new life somewhere more suitable for two young ladies alone in the world. And if we refuse—" Carver's smile did not reach his eyes. "I have been speaking with Judge Whitmore about your situation. Two women, unmarried, without male guardianship, attempting to hold property in ways that may violate territorial law." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless regret. "There are legal questions that will need to be resolved. The county may need to intervene. For your own protection, of course." Sina walked toward his horse until she stood close enough to touch it. "My grandfather claimed this land 30 years ago," she said, her voice steady and cold as the winter air around them. "My father inherited it legally when my grandfather died. We inherited it from our father according to the laws of this territory. There is no violation of any law, natural or otherwise." "Judges interpret laws," Carver replied, "and judges can often be persuaded to see things in new and interesting ways." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. Marin had stopped sketching. Her face was pale beneath the cold. "He means to take everything we have," she whispered. "Yes," Sina agreed. "He does. Can we stop him?" Sina looked at her sister, at the cave behind them, at the mountain rising into the gray December sky. "We build faster," she said. "We finish before he can move against us legally. We prove that this is not abandoned property, not land held by helpless women who cannot care for themselves. We prove that we are here to stay." Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned back to her sketch pad with new determination in her eyes. Then I will need more detailed measurements, she said, for the fireplace especially. If grandfather's notes are correct about the chimney gap, we need to position it exactly right or the whole system will fail. They worked until darkness made it impossible to continue, and the next day they worked again, and the day after that, and slowly, impossibly, the cave house began to take shape. If you are still watching, you probably know someone like Sina and Marin, someone who was told they could not succeed, someone who was mocked for trying something different, someone who kept working anyway, day after day, refusing to give up no matter how many people told them they were foolish. Think about that person as you continue watching, because what happened next in Silver Creek would test the Halverson sisters in ways they never expected. They would face enemies with more power than they could imagine. They would face moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice, but they would also find allies in places they never expected to look. And in the end, they would prove something that the whole valley had forgotten. The mountain does not care who laughs. The mountain only cares who survives. The lumber came first. Sina and Marin could not afford to buy wood from the mill in town. Their father had left them the homestead, but almost no money. The few dollars remaining had been carefully spent on glass for windows, an extravagance that Sina considered essential for both light and morale. Everything else they would have to provide themselves. Through December and into January, they cut trees on their own land. Douglas fir mostly, the straight tall pines that grew thick on the mountainside above the cave. Sina had learned to use an axe from her father in the years before his death. Now she taught Marin. They worked in tandem, the way they did everything now. Sina swinging while Marin rested, then Marin swinging while Sina rested, back and forth for hours until the tree groaned and cracked and crashed to the snow-covered ground. Then they would trim the branches, cut the trunk into manageable lengths, and drag the logs down to the cave using ropes and determination and muscles that grew stronger with each passing week. The work was brutal. Sina's hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again over the calluses. Her shoulders ached constantly from the endless lifting and hauling. She fell asleep each night the moment she lay down, and woke each morning feeling as if she had not rested at all. But the pile of lumber grew, and in town the mockery grew with it. The gossips at the general store had endless opinions about the Halverson twins and their foolish project. They discussed the situation over coffee and purchases, their voices carrying clearly to anyone who happened to be nearby. Those poor, deluded girls, they said, building a house in a cave like something from the Stone Age. Someone should really stop them before they hurt themselves. But no one tried to stop them, and no one offered to help. Then on a gray morning in late January, a wagon appeared on the trail leading up to the cave. Sina set down her axe and watched it approach with wary eyes. The wagon was heavily loaded with lumber, good lumber, already cut and planed and ready for use. And the woman driving it was someone Sina recognized, but had never spoken to directly. Britt Svensson. She was 45 years old, Norwegian like the Halverson sisters, widowed 3 years ago when her husband Christopher died in a mine collapse, in Carver's mine. The same kind of accident that had killed other men over the years, accidents that were never properly investigated, questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Britt pulled her wagon to a stop near the cave entrance and climbed down with the easy grace of a woman who had spent her life doing physical work. She was tall and strong, with gray-streaked blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands that showed decades of hard labor. "I did not come to help for free," she said without preamble or greeting. "I came to learn." Sina studied her for a long moment. "Learn what?" "How to build something that will not kill me." Britt's eyes were steady, unwavering, filled with a grief that had hardened into determination. "My husband died because Carver refused to shore up the mine tunnels properly. He cut corners to save money, and men died for his greed. My husband died." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "I have been living in a cabin not much better than yours. Cold in winter, hot in summer, falling apart a little more with every passing year. When I heard what you were doing up here, building into the mountain the way our people did in the old country, I came to see for myself." She looked past Sina to the cave entrance, to the walls that were beginning to take shape inside. "Your grandfather knew things," she continued, Things that people in this valley have forgotten or never learned. I want to know those things too. Marin emerged from the cave, sketchpad in hand, and stood beside her sister. The two twins exchanged a glance, the silent communication that they had developed over 19 years of shared life. The lumber, Sina said, gesturing toward the loaded wagon. Where did you get it? I sold everything Christopher left me except the wagon, the horse, and the clothes on my back. Britt's voice was matter-of-fact, unemotional. This lumber is what I could afford with the money. It is not payment, it is investment, in knowledge that might save my life someday. Sina considered the woman before her. Britt Svensson had lost her husband in Carver's mine, just as Sina and Maren had lost their father. She had been living alone for 3 years, surviving winters in a cabin that offered little more protection than the Halverson place. She had come here not out of pity or charity, but out of a desperate need to learn how to protect herself. Come inside, Sina said finally. I will show you what we are building and how we are building it. From that day forward, 3 women worked on the cave house instead of 2. Britt proved herself invaluable almost immediately. She was stronger than she looked, capable of carrying loads that made even Sina struggle. She had a practical mind that identified problems before they became serious obstacles. She asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to the answers, and she brought information that changed everything. Carver knows about the silver, she said one evening in mid-February, as they sat by a small fire at the cave entrance, resting after a long day of work. Sina looked up sharply from the rope she was coiling. What silver? Britt reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, worn and creased from much handling. I found this hidden in Christopher's things after he died. It is a geological survey from 1870, commissioned by the territorial government. There is a vein of silver somewhere on this mountain, small but potentially valuable. The survey marks its approximate location. She unfolded the paper carefully and pointed to a spot on the faded map. The location marked on the survey was directly adjacent to the Halverson property line. Perhaps on their land, perhaps just over the boundary. The old survey was not precise enough to say for certain. Carver has been buying up land all around your property for years, Britt continued. Everyone assumed he was simply expanding his empire, accumulating land because that is what rich men do. But I think he knows about the silver. I think he has always known. And I think the vein might extend onto your land. Sina stared at the faded map, her mind racing through the implications. This was why Carver wanted their property so desperately. Not because he cared about 2 orphan women or their welfare. Not because he wanted to help them. Because somewhere beneath their feet, hidden and unknown, lay wealth that he intended to possess by any means necessary. We cannot mine silver, Maren said quietly from across the fire. We do not have the equipment, the knowledge, the money to even begin. No, Sina agreed, but we do not have to mine it ourselves. We just have to keep Carver from taking our land out from under us. She looked at Britt with new intensity. How much time do we have before he moves against us in court? Spring, probably. The courts do not meet during the worst winter months, but he will file his petition as soon as the weather breaks and the passes are clear enough for travel. Spring. They had until spring to finish the house, to prove they were permanently occupying their land, to establish themselves as residents who could not simply be declared absent or legally incompetent. Then we work faster, Sina said grimly, and we work smarter, and we finish before Jedediah Carver can destroy everything we are trying to build. The work intensified. February brought brutally cold temperatures, but also a new face to the cave house project. His name was Tobias Reyes. He was 21 years old, the son of a Spanish immigrant who had died in one of Carver's mine tunnels, and a Mexican mother who still lived in a drafty cabin on the edge of town. He appeared at the cave entrance one afternoon, hat clutched nervously in his hands, dark eyes filled with uncertainty. I came to learn, he said, echoing Britt's words from weeks before. My mother, Elena, is sick. The cold makes her cough blood all through the night. I need to build her something better, something that will keep her warm through the winters. The doctor says she will not survive another cold season in our current home. Sina studied him carefully. He was young, clearly strong, obviously capable of hard physical work. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hands were already calloused from labor. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker than simple determination. Why come to us? She asked. There are builders in town who could teach you carpentry. Tobias looked away, unable to meet her gaze. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. I was there when your father died, in the mine. I was working the tunnel next to his when the supports gave way and everything collapsed. He paused, struggling to continue. I spoke to him just before it happened. He told me he wished he had listened to his own father, that his father had known a better way to build, but he had been too proud to learn it. Sina felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been struck. I did not understand what he meant at the time, Tobias continued quietly. Not until I heard what you were doing up here, building into the mountain the way your grandfather had designed. Then I understood everything. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes directly. I cannot bring your father back. Nothing can change what happened in that mine. But I can learn what he should have learned. I can build what he should have built. Maybe that means something. Maybe it does not. But I have to try. Maren had appeared beside Sina during this exchange. She looked at Tobias, at his worn clothes and calloused hands and haunted expression, and something in her face softened. Can you handle an axe? She asked. Yes. Can you follow instructions without arguing? Yes. Maren glanced at her sister, and something passed between them without words. Then come inside, Sina said finally. There is more than enough work to go around. Tobias became the fourth member of their unlikely construction crew. He worked harder than anyone Sina had ever seen, arriving before dawn and staying until darkness made further work impossible. From the moment he picked up a tool until the moment he set it down, he gave everything he had. He never complained about the cold, the difficulty, or the exhaustion. He never asked for anything in return for his labor, and slowly, over the weeks that followed, something developed between him and Sina that neither of them spoke about openly. She noticed it first in the way he listened when she explained the building principles her grandfather had developed. He did not just hear the words, he understood them. He asked questions that showed genuine comprehension, sometimes suggesting modifications that actually improved on the original designs. He noticed it in the way she moved when she worked, the precision of her movements, the efficiency of her labor, the quiet determination that drove her forward even when exhaustion pulled at every muscle. He admired her strength without feeling threatened by it. They worked side by side through February and into March, and something grew between them like the walls of the cave house itself, strong and steady and built to last. Neither of them had time to discuss it. There was too much work to be done, too many obstacles to overcome, but it was there nonetheless, acknowledged in glances and small kindnesses, and the way they always seemed to know where the other was without looking. The accident happened in the third week of March. They were fitting the main support beam for the sleeping loft into place, the single heaviest piece of timber in the entire structure. The beam was nearly 20 feet long and thick as a man's torso. Positioning it correctly required all four of them working in perfect coordination. Sina stood on the scaffolding they had constructed, guiding the beam into the socket they had carved for it. Maren stood below, calling out adjustments based on her design drawings. Tobias and Britt held ropes attached to a pulley system, controlling the beam's slow rise into position. The rope slipped. Perhaps it was worn in a place they had not noticed. Perhaps the knot was not as tight as it should have been. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of too much misfortune finally breaking through. The beam swung free, dropping several feet before the backup rope caught it. Sina shouted a warning, but it was too late. Maren was directly in the path of the swinging timber. She turned at the sound of her sister's voice, saw the massive beam coming toward her, and had no time to move out of its way. Britt threw herself forward without hesitation. She shoved Maren aside with both hands, putting all her strength into the push. The younger woman stumbled backward, off balance but clear of the beam's path. But the movement left Britt exposed. The swinging timber caught her across the shoulder with a sickening crack, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the cave floor. And the beam was still moving. Maren, knocked off balance by Britt's desperate push, stumbled backward over a pile of lumber. Her foot caught on a protruding log. She fell hard, twisting as she went down. The beam completed its swing and came down on her outstretched leg. Sina was down the scaffolding in seconds, but the damage was already done. Maren lay on the cave floor, her face white with shock, her leg pinned beneath the massive timber that had finally come to rest. "Do not try to move her," Britt gasped. She was on the ground nearby, clutching her shoulder with her good hand, but her eyes were clear and focused. We need to lift the beam straight up. If we try to drag it off, we will make the break worse. Tobias was already in position at one end of the beam. Sina joined him at the other. Together, they gripped the timber and lifted with every ounce of strength they possessed, their muscles screaming with the effort. The beam rose. Britt, despite her injured shoulder, crawled forward and pulled Maren clear of the danger. They lowered the beam carefully to the floor, then turned to see the extent of the damage. Maren's leg was broken, obviously and badly broken. The angle was wrong below the knee, the swelling already beginning to distort the shape of her calf. She had not screamed when the beam struck her, but now small whimpers escaped her lips, sounds of pain she could not suppress no matter how hard she tried. "We need a doctor," Tobias said, his voice tight with urgency. "The doctor in Silver Creek will not come." Britt's voice was flat with bitter certainty. "He is afraid of the cursed twins. He told me so himself when I asked him about treating various ailments. He said he wants no part of their misfortune." Sina felt rage rise in her chest, hot and bitter as bile. Her sister was injured, possibly crippled for life, and no one in the town would help them because of stupid superstitions and small-minded fear. Tobias touched her arm, drawing her attention. "There is an old doctor in Georgetown, about 15 miles from here. He retired from practice years ago, but I have heard he still treats people sometimes. People that the regular doctors refuse to see. He might be willing to come." Sina looked at her sister, at the leg that desperately needed proper setting, at the face contorted with pain that could only get worse as time passed. "Go," she said. "Ride as fast as you can and bring him back." Tobias was on his horse and gone within minutes, disappearing down the mountain trail at a dangerous speed. The wait that followed was the longest 4 hours of Sina's life. She sat beside Maren, holding her sister's hand, watching her face contort with every small movement. Britt, despite her own injured shoulder, made a temporary splint from scrap wood, immobilizing the broken leg as best she could. But they all knew it was not enough. Without proper medical attention, Maren could lose the use of her leg forever. Or worse. Maren drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words that Sina could barely understand. In her lucid moments, she tried to speak clearly. "I ruined everything," she whispered through cracked lips. "No, you did nothing wrong. We cannot finish without me helping. The project will fail. Everyone was right about us." Sina squeezed her sister's hand tightly, fighting back tears. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Your leg is broken, not your mind. You can still design. You can still draw. You can still tell us exactly what to do and how to do it. When your leg heals, you will walk again, and we will finish this house together, exactly as we planned." Maren's pain-glazed eyes found her sister's face. "You promise?" "I promise." Now think about what Sina was feeling in that moment. Her sister lay injured, possibly crippled for life. The doctor in town had refused to come. The house was still only 3/4 complete. Carver was preparing his legal assault, ready to take their land the moment the courts reopened in spring. And winter was far from over, with weeks of cold still waiting to test their inadequate shelter. Most people would have given up right then. Most people would have accepted that the universe had spoken, that some dreams are simply too big for ordinary people to achieve, that the safe path of surrender is always easier than the dangerous road of persistence. But Sina was not most people, and neither was Maren. Keep watching to see what happened next, because the following months would test both sisters in ways they never could have imagined. And the transformation that Maren would undergo, from the sister who had wanted to give up and go to Denver to the architect who designed every detail of their salvation, would prove that sometimes our greatest strengths are forged in the fire of our deepest wounds. The doctor arrived as darkness was falling over the mountains. His name was Abel Whitfield. He was 73 years old, retired from regular practice for nearly a decade, living alone in a small cabin outside Georgetown with his medical books and his memories of better days. But his hands were still steady when they needed to be, and his eyes were still sharp enough to see what needed seeing. When he examined Maren's leg, he knew immediately what had to be done. "Simple fracture of the tibia," he said after careful palpation. "Clean break, no bone protruding through the skin. She will walk again, but not for at least 6 weeks. probably 8, and she must not put any weight on this leg until I give permission, or she risks permanent damage. He set the leg while Sina held Marin's hand, and Britt held her shoulders steady. Marin screamed once, a sound that would echo in Sina's nightmares for months to come. Then she fainted, which Dr. Whitfield said was probably a mercy. When the leg was properly splinted and bandaged with clean cloth, the old doctor turned his attention to Britt's shoulder. It was dislocated, not broken. He reset the joint with a quick, practiced movement that made Britt gasp but drew no scream. "You will both live," he said finally, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "But you both need rest. Real rest. No physical labor for several weeks minimum." Sina looked at the half-finished house, at the spring that was rapidly approaching, at the legal deadline that could not be moved or postponed. "We cannot afford to rest," she said quietly. "Not now." Dr. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, his old eyes seeing more than she might have wished. Then he looked around the cave, at the walls taking shape, at the floor that was nearly finished, at the massive stone fireplace rising against the cave wall. "I have seen houses like this," he said thoughtfully, "many years ago, in Norway, when I was a young man traveling before medical school. My wife was Norwegian. She took me to her childhood village once, showed me how her people had lived for centuries in that harsh climate." He paused, remembering. Her people survived winters that would have killed anyone else in Europe. They survived because they built like this, in harmony with the mountain rather than in opposition to it. They let the earth protect them instead of fighting against it. He turned back to Sina, his expression serious. "Your grandfather was a wise man. Finish what he designed. But be careful. The world has a way of punishing women who dare to do things differently than tradition demands." He gathered his medical bag and prepared to leave. "I will return in 2 weeks to check on the leg and the shoulder. In the meantime, let them rest as much as possible. And try to get some rest yourself. You will be no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." He rode away into the darkness, leaving them alone with their injuries and their fears, and their stubborn determination to succeed despite everything. Sina sat beside her sleeping sister and thought about what the doctor had said. The world punishes women who do things differently. She knew it was true. She had known it all her life, had felt the weight of that punishment every time someone whispered about the cursed twins, every time a door closed in her face, every time someone assumed she could not do something simply because of the body she had been born into. But punishment only mattered if you let it stop you. And Sina Halvorsen was not going to be stopped by anything. The next 6 weeks transformed everything. Marin could not walk. She could barely sit up without waves of pain shooting through her injured leg. She was confined to a makeshift bed in the corner of the cave, unable to help with any physical labor. But she could still think, and she could still draw, and she could still direct. From her bed, Marin became the architect and supervisor of everything they built. She sketched detailed plans for every remaining element of the house, calculating angles and measurements with mathematical precision. She directed the placement of every beam and board, the positioning of every stone in the fireplace, the installation of every window. Her injury had taken away her ability to work with her hands. It had given her something even more valuable in return, the time and necessity to work with her mind. And Sina built exactly what Marin designed. She worked 16-hour days, pushing herself past exhaustion into some strange territory beyond tiredness, where every movement was automatic and only willpower kept her going. Tobias worked beside her, matching her hour for hour. Britt, her shoulder slowly healing, did what she could with one good arm. They worked through storms that would have stopped anyone else. They worked through temperatures so cold that their breath froze on their scarves. They worked through setbacks and mistakes and moments when giving up seemed like the only sane choice. By early April, the house was essentially complete. Not perfect, not finished in every detail, but livable, functional, warm. And then Jedediah Carver made his move. The court summons arrived on April 15th. Carver had filed a formal petition with the territorial court, declaring the Halvorsen property abandoned and requesting that ownership be transferred to him as the nearest substantial landholder with the resources to develop it properly. He claimed the sisters had abandoned their legal homestead and were living in a primitive cave dwelling that did not constitute proper occupation under territorial law. The hearing was set for May 1st, less than 3 weeks away. Sina read the summons twice, her hands trembling with barely controlled rage. "He is claiming the land is abandoned," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "That we are not actually living here in any legally meaningful sense." "But we are living here," Britt pointed out. "The cave house is our home. We sleep here every night. We cook our meals here. We have built a permanent dwelling. But it is not officially completed, and we have not formally filed any paperwork establishing our residence." Sina crumpled the legal document in her fist. "He has been waiting for this moment, waiting for us to make a mistake or fail to complete some bureaucratic requirement, or give him any excuse he could exploit." Marin, still confined to her bed with her leg elevated, spoke firmly despite her weakness. "Then we give him something he did not expect. We finish every detail of the house before the hearing. We file every piece of paperwork that exists. We show the judge that this is a permanent, legal residence, fully occupied by the rightful owners." Sina looked at her sister. "In 3 weeks? We need another month at least to complete everything properly. Then we work every hour we have. We sleep less. We do whatever is necessary." Marin's eyes were fierce despite her injury and exhaustion. "We did not fight this hard and come this far to let Carver win now." Sina looked at her small, battered crew. Tobias, exhausted but determined, with dark circles under his eyes from weeks of inadequate sleep. Britt, working with a shoulder that still ached from her injury, refusing to quit or slow down. Marin, designing from her bed, unable to help physically, but absolutely essential to everything they accomplished. And herself, the eldest twin by perhaps an hour, the one who had started all of this with a journal and a dream. 3 weeks, she said. "We can do this." They finished on April 29th, 2 days before the hearing. Sina stood at the entrance of the cave house in the golden light of late afternoon and looked at what they had created together. It was beautiful. The front wall rose 12 feet, solid Douglas fir logs fitted together with precision that would impress any professional carpenter. 2 glass windows flanked a central door, letting warm spring light filter into the interior. The roof pitched upward into the natural shadow of the cave, its cedar shingles forming a warm reddish-brown contrast against the gray stone. Inside, the floor was smooth and level, the planking swept clean and polished by use. The massive stone fireplace dominated the back wall, its carefully constructed mass ready to absorb and radiate heat through the coldest winter nights. A sturdy ladder led to the sleeping loft, where comfortable beds waited under the natural stone ceiling. A table and chairs occupied the main living space, simple but well-made. This was not a cave. This was a home, and it was ready to be defended. The hearing took place in the small courthouse in Silver Creek. Sina arrived early, wearing the best dress she owned, the one her mother had made for her 18th birthday, and that she had carefully preserved through all the hardships since. Marin came with her, walking slowly with a crutch under one arm, her legs still splinted but healing well. Britt and Tobias sat in the public gallery, their presence a silent statement of support. Jedediah Carver arrived with 2 expensive lawyers from Denver and a look of absolute confidence on his well-fed face. He was going to lose. He just did not know it yet. The hearing lasted most of the day. Carver's lawyers presented their carefully prepared case with professional polish. The Halverson property was unoccupied, they argued. The original cabin had been abandoned. 2 women without male guardianship could not legally hold property under territorial law. The land should rightfully revert to the county and be sold to a responsible party capable of developing it properly. That responsible party, they made clear, would naturally be Jedediah Carver. Judge Whitmore listened to their arguments in thoughtful silence. He was 60 years old, appointed to the territorial bench by the governor himself, known throughout the region for being fair but firm. When Carver's lawyers finally finished their lengthy presentation, he turned to Sina. "Do you have a response to make, Miss Halverson?" Sina stood. She had prepared no formal speech. She had practiced no legal arguments in front of a mirror. She had only the truth in her grandfather's journal. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "this is the journal of my grandfather, Eric Halverson. It contains the original survey of our property, conducted in 1862, when he legally purchased the land from the territorial government. It also contains his signature, properly witnessed by 2 territorial officials of that time, along with his receipt for payment." She approached the judge's bench and handed over the precious journal. Judge Whitmore examined it carefully, comparing the signatures to documents from his own files. His eyebrows rose slightly as he studied the detailed maps and measurements Eric had made of his property. "This appears to be a legitimate legal document," he said finally. "The signatures and seals match records from that period in my files." "There is more, Your Honor," Sina continued. "My sister and I have been living on this property continuously since our parents' death last November. We have constructed a permanent dwelling that is fully occupied and maintained. I have here a signed statement from Dr. Abel Whitfield of Georgetown, who has visited our residence multiple times to provide medical treatment. I also have written statements from 3 other witnesses who can attest to our continuous occupation and the permanent nature of our dwelling." She handed over the carefully gathered documents. Carver's lawyers leaped to their feet, objecting strenuously, demanding additional time to review evidence, arguing that documents from retired doctors and hired workers should carry no legal weight. But Judge Whitmore silenced them with a raised hand. "I have seen and heard enough to render my decision," he said firmly. "This property was legally purchased in 1862. It was legally inherited by Gunnar Halvorson upon his father's death. It was legally inherited by these 2 young women upon their father's death, and it is currently occupied by those rightful owners in a permanent dwelling of their own construction." He looked directly at Carver, and his eyes were cold. "The petition for transfer of ownership is denied. This case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled, and I would strongly caution certain parties against any further attempts to manipulate this court for personal gain." He struck his gavel sharply against the bench, and Jedediah Carver, for the first time in his privileged and powerful life, found himself on the losing side of a legal battle. After the hearing ended, Carver found Sina on the courthouse steps. His face was flushed with barely controlled rage, all pretense of benevolent concern stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "You have won this particular battle," he said, his voice low and venomous. "But the war is far from over. Winter will come again. And when it does, when your precious cave house proves as inadequate as every other shelter in these mountains, I will still be here, waiting." Sina looked at him without fear, without anger, without any emotion except quiet certainty. "Your threats mean nothing to stone and earth," she said calmly. "We will still be standing when the snow falls, and the snow after that, and every snow that comes for the rest of our lives." She walked away without looking back. Behind her, Carver's impotent rage burned in the spring air, but she had already forgotten him. There was too much work still to be done. The months that followed the hearing passed quickly. Summer arrived, transforming the mountains into a green paradise that made the harsh winter seem like a distant memory. Sina and her crew used the warm months to complete every remaining detail of the cave house, to stockpile firewood for the coming winter, to prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. Marin's leg healed completely by July. She walked with a slight limp that would never entirely disappear, but she walked. She climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft. She hiked the trails around their property. She lived. The cave house proved everything Eric Halvorson had promised in his journal. Summer heat that baked the valley below barely penetrated the cool interior of the cave. The constant 54-degree temperature of the earth kept the dwelling comfortable without any effort. While other families sweltered in their wooden cabins, the Halvorson sisters lived in perfect comfort. Word began to spread. People who had mocked the project started asking quiet questions. How did the construction work? What principles were involved? Could similar techniques be applied to ordinary houses? The questions were tentative at first, ashamed, asked in whispers rather than open conversation. Sina answered them all with patient professionalism. She did not gloat. She did not remind anyone of their mockery or their predictions of failure. She simply explained what her grandfather had known, demonstrated what she had built, and offered to teach anyone who genuinely wanted to learn. Fall arrived with a blaze of golden aspens and the first hints of cold in the night air. And then, in late December, the sky changed. For 3 consecutive days, the sky turned a color that none of the young people in Silver Creek had ever seen before. Not gray, not white, not the pale blue of winter. It turned yellow, a sickly, unnatural yellow, like ancient parchment or infected wounds. Old Arvid Magnusson came to visit on December 29th. He was 82 years old, bent by decades of hard labor in fields and forests, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. He had survived things that would have killed younger men. He had witnessed winters that people spoke of only in whispers, and he was frightened. "Look at the sky," he said, pointing toward the horizon with a gnarled finger. "That color. Do you see it?" Sina looked. The yellow had deepened since morning, taking on an almost greenish tinge at the edges that made her stomach clench with instinctive unease. "I have seen this color twice before in my long life," Arvid continued, his voice heavy with memory. "Once in Bergen in 1846, when I was a young man barely older than you are now. Once in Minnesota in 1873, before I came to these mountains. Both times, storms followed, storms that killed." He grabbed Sina's arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her flesh. The Bergen storm buried entire villages under snow that did not melt until May. 200 people died, frozen in their homes or lost in the white chaos. Ships in the harbor were crushed by ice. The Minnesota storm caught people working in their fields. They found them standing upright, frozen solid where they stood, still holding their tools as if they had simply stopped moving and never started again. Fenrir began to howl from inside the cave house, a long, mournful sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his old, tired body. He had been restless for days, refusing to settle, pacing the floor with anxious energy despite his age. "Your wolf dog knows," Arvid said grimly. "Animals always know before we do. They feel what human senses cannot detect. They hear frequencies our ears cannot perceive." He released Sina's arm and stepped back, his old eyes filled with genuine fear. "Whatever you have built in that cave, I pray it is strong enough. Because what is coming?" He shook his head slowly. "What is coming will test everything, every building, every belief, every soul." He left without another word, hurrying down the mountain trail with more speed than his ancient legs should have been able to manage. That night, Sina made Tobias help her stack firewood inside the cave until the piles reached the ceiling. They filled every available container with water. They brought inside every preserved food item they had prepared during the summer months. They reinforced the door with additional bars. And Fenrir did not stop his mournful howling until dawn. The storm arrived on the morning of January 5th, 1893. It began with a sound like distant thunder, though no lightning flickered in the sickly yellow sky. The sound was wind, building somewhere in the high peaks above the valley, gathering strength, preparing to descend. By noon, the wind was screaming across the mountainside at 80 miles per hour, tearing branches from trees and sending them spinning through the air like missiles. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted to 25 degrees below zero. By midnight, visibility had been reduced to absolute nothing. White chaos filled the world outside the cave house. Snow driven horizontally by the shrieking wind piled against the entrance, building drifts that grew higher with every passing hour. Inside the cave house, Sina fed the fire and watched the simple thermometer she had hung on the wall. Outside, 28 degrees below zero. Inside, 56 degrees above zero. The cave house was holding. The first night passed in strange isolation. They could hear the storm raging outside their walls, could feel the pressure of the wind against the sturdy wooden front, could sense the massive power of nature unleashed in all its fury. But inside they were safe. Inside they were warm. Inside, the principles Eric Halverson had developed over a lifetime of building in harsh climates were proving themselves beyond any possible doubt. Sina did not sleep. She sat in a chair near the door, listening for any sound of failure, any creak or groan that might signal weakness in the structure. But the walls held firm. The roof remained secure. Everything her grandfather had designed, everything she had built with her own hands, was working exactly as intended. Around her, the others slept with varying degrees of peace. Maren in her bed near the fire, Britt on her cot against the wall, Tobias on a pallet near the door, ready to help if needed. And Fenrir lay at Sina's feet, his old eyes open and watchful, sharing the vigil with the woman who had become his final master. The second day brought no relief. If anything, the storm intensified as the hours crawled past. The temperature dropped to 35 below, then 40 below. At 40 below, exposed human skin freezes solid in less than 5 minutes. Breath crystallizes into ice before it travels a foot from the mouth. The world outside becomes actively hostile to all forms of life. Sina checked the thermometer at noon on the second day. She did not need the instrument to tell her what she already knew. The frost patterns on the small window told the story clearly enough. Outside, death waited with patient hunger. Inside, life continued in warm safety. The fire crackled steadily in the stone fireplace. The massive walls radiated gentle heat accumulated over days of careful burning. Beyond the wooden door, a killing cold waited with infinite patience. But it could not enter. It could not touch them. The mountain was keeping its promise. Stop and think about this for a moment. Everything Sina's grandfather had designed, everything she had risked her future to build, everything the whole valley had mocked as foolish and primitive was working exactly as intended. While cabins throughout Silver Creek shuddered and groaned under the assault of the storm, while families huddled together burning their furniture to stay alive, while the temperature dropped to levels that killed everything it touched, the cave house remained warm and safe and secure. This was vindication. This was proof. This was everything Sina had worked for through months of exhausting labor and endless mockery. But she did not feel triumphant. She felt worried, because somewhere out there in the white chaos, people were dying. People who had laughed at her, people who had refused to learn from her, people who were now paying the ultimate price for their stubborn refusal to see what she had seen, and she could do nothing to help them. Not yet. The pounding came at 2 in the morning on the third night. Fenrir heard it first. The old wolf dog leaped to his feet with more energy than he had shown in months, growling deep in his throat, hackles raised along his spine. Sina was awake and moving toward the door before anyone else had stirred from sleep. The sound came again, faint but desperate, rhythmic but weakening. Someone was out there in the killing storm, pounding on the door with the last of their fading strength. Sina looked at Tobias, who had appeared at her shoulder with a lantern in his hand. Their eyes met in the flickering light. Then she lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The wind hit her like a physical assault, driving snow and ice into her face with stinging force. Cold beyond anything she had ever experienced, clawed at every inch of exposed skin, trying to steal the warmth from her body in seconds. And there, barely visible in the swirling white chaos, stood 2 figures. One was tall, broad-shouldered, expensive coat crusted with ice that had formed from his own frozen breath. His silver watch chain was invisible under layers of frost. The other was smaller, slumped against the first, clearly unable to stand without support. Jedediah Carver and his wife, Constance. Sina stood frozen in the doorway for one eternal second. This was the man who had tried to steal her land through legal manipulation. The man who had called her cursed and unnatural. The man who had threatened that winter would prove her wrong about everything. And now he stood at her door, his wife dying in his arms, begging for shelter with eyes that had lost all their arrogance and power. Maren appeared at Sina's shoulder, awakened by the commotion. She looked at Carver, at Constance, at the killing storm raging behind them. "They will die out there," she said quietly. "In minutes, they will die." Sina knew her sister was right. She reached out into the howling wind, grabbed Carver's ice-encrusted arm, and pulled with all her strength. "Come inside," she shouted over the roar of the storm. "Now! Move!" They hauled the Carvers through the doorway and slammed the door against the wind. Tobias threw his weight against it, while Sina dropped the heavy bar back into place. Then they turned to see what the storm had delivered to them. Constance Carver was dying. Her lips had turned blue. Her fingertips were black with severe frostbite. Her ears had the waxy look of flesh that had frozen and would never fully recover. She was barely conscious, shivering so violently that her teeth chattered audibly, her breath coming in shallow gasps that seemed to grow weaker with each passing moment. Jedediah was not much better. His hands were blackened, his face was raw and bleeding from ice crystals driven into the skin. His expensive clothes were soaked through and literally freezing to his body as they watched. "Our house," he managed through chattering teeth, each word a struggle against the cold that had invaded every part of his body. The roof collapsed under the snow. The chimney failed. Everything was on fire and freezing at the same time. We had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Sina looked at the man who had spent months trying to destroy her. Then she looked at his wife, who had never done anything wrong, who was dying because she had married a cruel and arrogant man. Britt, get every blanket we have. Tobias, heat water for warm drinks. Marin, help me get these wet clothes off before they freeze to death inside our home. For the next 3 hours, they fought to save Constance Carver's life. They stripped away her frozen clothing and wrapped her in every blanket and quilt they possessed. They placed heated stones around her body to provide external warmth. They forced warm broth into her mouth, spoonful by spoonful, until she could swallow on her own, and color began to return to her gray cheeks. Britt worked on Jedediah's blackened hands, cleaning the frostbitten flesh with practiced care, applying healing salve, wrapping them in clean bandages. 2 of his fingers would never fully recover. He would carry the scars of this night for the rest of his life. Marin sat with Constance through the darkest hours, holding her hand, speaking softly, helping her understand that she was safe now, warm now, alive now against all odds. And Sina watched over everything, making sure the fire stayed high, making sure the supplies held out, making sure that the people who had mocked her did not die in her home. The storm continued for 3 more days, and with each passing day, more refugees arrived at the cave house door. On the morning of the 4th day, the Fletcher family appeared out of the white chaos. Reverend Fletcher, his wife Sarah, and their 3 young children had been driven from their home when the church roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The same reverend who had preached against the Halverson sisters from his pulpit now stood at their door, his ministerial dignity stripped away by desperation, begging for shelter that he had once condemned as primitive and ungodly. Sina let them in without a word of reproach. Later that same day, Virgil Crawford arrived, half carrying his 7-year-old sister Emma through snow that came up to his waist. Their parents Thomas and Mary had gone out during a brief lull in the storm to check on their livestock and had never returned. Virgil was the young man who had loudly wagered money at the saloon that the cave house would collapse before summer. Now he wept openly as he carried his silent sister through the door, thanking Sina over and over with words that came out broken and barely coherent. Sina let them in. By the end of the 4th day, 16 people crowded into the cave house that everyone had said would fail. 16 people, most of whom had laughed at the Halverson sisters, most of whom had called them cursed, unnatural, doomed to failure and death. Now they huddled together by the fire, sharing blankets, sharing food, sharing survival. Think about this scene for a moment. 16 people crowded into a cave house that everyone said would collapse. 16 people, many of whom had laughed at the Halverson sisters, called them cursed, refused to help them, tried to take their land through legal manipulation. Now they pressed together for warmth, sharing food that Sina had stockpiled, drinking water that Sina had stored, surviving because Sina had refused to listen when everyone told her she was wrong. This is what vindication looks like. Not shouting, "I told you so," at defeated enemies. Not turning people away from your door because they once turned away from you. But opening that door anyway, even for the people who hurt you most deeply, because some things are more important than being right. What would you have done in Sina's position? Would you have opened the door for Jedediah Carver, the man who tried to steal everything from you? Think about that as you watch what happens next, because the storm was not over yet, and the moment that would define Sina's legacy, the moment that would be remembered for generations, was still to come. There was a moment on the 4th night that Sina would remember for the rest of her life. Little Emma Crawford had not spoken a single word since her brother carried her through the door. She sat in a corner, wrapped in blankets, her eyes staring at nothing anyone else could see. Her brother Virgil had tried everything to reach her, talking softly, offering food, holding her close. Nothing worked. She remained locked inside herself, trapped by trauma too large for a 7-year-old mind to process. Fenrir rose from his spot near the fire. The old wolf dog, who had barely moved in days, who had been conserving his fading strength for some purpose only he understood, stood on his stiff legs and walked slowly across the crowded room. People shifted aside to let him pass, watching curiously as he picked his way around sleeping bodies and outstretched feet. He stopped beside Emma. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the little girl with his ancient, knowing eyes. Then he lay down beside her, pressing his warm body against hers, resting his grizzled head gently on her lap. Emma looked down at the old wolf dog. Her small hand, still raw from exposure to the killing cold, reached out hesitantly and touched his silver fur. "Is he scared?" she asked in a tiny voice. They were the first words she had spoken in 3 days. Sina knelt beside the little girl, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "No," she said gently. "Fenrir is never scared. He is very old and very wise, and he has seen many storms. He knows that storms always end, and he knows when someone needs a friend to sit beside them until the storm is over." Emma's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks in silent streams. She wrapped her thin arms around Fenrir's neck and buried her face in his warm fur. And finally, she began to cry. Great, heaving sobs that shook her small body, releasing grief and fear and trauma that had been locked inside her for days. The sound was painful to hear, the sound of a child's heart breaking, but it was also the sound of healing beginning. Virgil Crawford watched from across the crowded room, his own eyes wet with grateful tears. He had wagered money that this cave would collapse. Now his little sister was alive because of it. The storm broke on the morning of the 6th day. Sina woke to silence so profound it seemed almost unnatural after days of constant wind and chaos. True silence, the complete absence of howling and roaring, the sudden peace that follows any great violence. She rose from the chair where she had been keeping watch and opened the door. The world outside had been utterly transformed. Snow lay 15 feet deep in places, forming drifts and sculptures that bore no resemblance to the landscape she had known. Trees were down everywhere. Massive pines snapped like kindling by the force of the wind. The sky was a pale, perfect blue, utterly peaceful and serene, as if the storm had never happened at all. But the storm had happened, and its consequences were only beginning to be understood. They dug pathways through the snow over the following days, creating routes that connected the cave house to the wider world. As the refugees departed one by one to assess the damage to their homes, the full scope of the disaster became clear. 7 houses in Silver Creek had been completely destroyed, reduced to piles of timber and frozen debris. The church had lost its entire roof, its pews now buried under snow that had drifted through the open ceiling. The general store had partially collapsed. Carver's mansion, the largest and finest house in the entire region, was a total ruin, its expensive lumber scattered across half an acre of frozen ground. And there were deaths. 4 people had not survived the storm. Old Hanson Erickson, who had lived alone in a cabin at the edge of town. He had no family, no neighbors close enough to help, no one to check on him when the worst of the storm hit. They found his frozen body sitting upright in his chair, as if he had simply stopped living and never moved again. A young mother named Clara Simmons and her infant daughter Grace. Their cabin had been poorly built, and when the chimney failed and filled the interior with smoke, they had faced an impossible choice between suffocation and freezing. They had chosen freezing, fleeing outside in desperation. The storm had killed them within sight of their door. A miner named Patrick Callahan, who had tried to reach his livestock in the stable during what seemed like a lull in the storm. The lull had ended with sudden fury. He never made it back. 4 deaths. 4 people who might have lived if their shelters had been better built. 4 people who might have survived if they had learned what Eric Halverson had known. 4 people whose deaths proved that the old ways still mattered, that knowledge passed down through generations could mean the difference between life and death. Sina stood in the ruins of Carver's mansion on a bright January morning, surrounded by the scattered remnants of his wealth and power, and felt no joy at all. This was not victory. This was tragedy. If people had listened, if people had been willing to learn, if pride and prejudice had not blinded them to wisdom offered freely. These deaths did not have to happen. This destruction was not inevitable. But it had happened anyway because people refused to see what was right in front of them. The community gathered at the damaged church 2 weeks after the storm finally ended. 34 people attended the meeting, filling the building that still lacked a proper roof. Many of those present showed visible signs of cold injury, blackened fingers that would never fully heal, frostbitten ears that had turned dark and leathery, faces still raw and swollen from exposure to conditions that should have killed them. All of them looked at the Halverson sisters differently now, not with suspicion or fear or superstitious dread, with something that looked very much like respect. Jedediah Carver stood first. He was not the same man who had once threatened Scene on the courthouse steps. His hands were heavily bandaged, his face was gaunt from pain and sleepless nights. His silver watch chain was notably absent. His entire bearing had changed, as if the storm had stripped away the arrogance that had defined him and left something more human in its place. "I need to say something," he began, his voice rough with emotion he could barely control. The ruined church fell silent. Every eye turned to the man who had been the most powerful person in Silver Creek, who was now reduced to bandages and borrowed clothes and the charity of people he had once despised. For months, I told anyone who would listen that Sina Halverson was building herself a grave. I called her cursed. I called her primitive. I called her an embarrassment to decent people everywhere. I tried to take her land through legal manipulation because I believed she had no right to own property, no right to make decisions, no right to do anything except accept the charity of her betters. He paused, gathering himself for what came next. On the third night of the storm, my roof collapsed under the weight of snow. My chimney failed and filled my house with smoke. My wife was dying in my arms, and I had only one place to go. Only one shelter in all of Silver Creek that I knew would still be standing. He turned to look directly at Sina, and his eyes were wet with tears he did not try to hide. I walked 3 miles through the worst storm in my memory. 3 miles through cold that wanted to kill me with every step. 3 miles to the door of the woman I had tried to destroy. And when I arrived, freezing, desperate, with nothing left but my dying wife and my ruined pride. His voice cracked, and he had to stop for a moment before continuing. She opened the door, without hesitation, without conditions, without even a moment of satisfaction at seeing me brought so low. She saved my wife's life. She saved my life. She saved the lives of 16 people during that storm, using knowledge that I called foolish and outdated and primitive. He took a shaking breath. "I do not deserve forgiveness. I am not asking for it. I just want everyone here to know the truth about what I did and about what she did. The difference between us could not be more clear." He sat down heavily as if the speech had exhausted the last of his strength. For a long moment, the ruined church remained completely silent. Then Reverend Fletcher stood. "I too owe an apology that I can never truly repay," he said quietly, his ministerial voice subdued and humbled. "I preached against these women from this very pulpit. I called their ways ungodly and primitive. I encouraged my congregation to shun them and avoid them and treat them as outcasts." He looked at Sina with genuine shame in his eyes. "And when my home collapsed and my family was freezing and I had nowhere else to turn, they took us in. They did not ask whether we had prayed correctly or believed the right doctrines. They simply helped us. They showed us more Christian charity in one night than I have shown in a lifetime of sermons. More people stood, more apologies were offered. The confessions built upon each other, a wave of acknowledgement sweeping through the damaged church. Virgil Crawford approached Sina after the formal speeches ended. His face was still marked by frostbite, and his hands trembled as he held out a worn $20 bill. "I bet this money that your cave would collapse before summer," he said quietly. "I was a fool and a bully, and I am sorry for every word I ever said against you." He pressed the money into her hand. "You won the bet, but you won a lot more than that." One by one, the people of Silver Creek came forward. The shopkeeper who had refused to sell supplies to the cursed twins offered to provide whatever materials they needed at no charge. The doctor who had declined to treat Marin's broken leg asked what he could do to make amends. The women who had whispered behind their hands and excluded the sisters from every social gathering now asked if they could visit, if they could learn, if they could somehow be forgiven. When the last person had spoken, Sina finally stood. "We did not build our home to prove anyone wrong," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the damaged building. "We built it to survive. Our grandfather designed it. Our father should have built it, but was too proud. We were left with no choice except to try." She looked around at the gathered faces, seeing shame and gratitude, and the beginning of genuine change. "The storm is over, but winter is not finished, and next winter will come, and the winter after that. If you want to learn what our grandfather knew, we will teach you. Not for money, not for apologies, but because knowledge should be shared, and because no one else should ever die from cold that could have been prevented. She paused, letting the words settle into the silence. What matters now is not who was right or wrong. What matters is that we are all still breathing. Let us make sure that when the next storm comes, everyone survives. 3 months after the storm, a surveyor from Denver confirmed what Britt's old document had suggested. There was indeed silver beneath the Halverson land, a small but potentially valuable vein that extended from deeper in the mountain onto their property. The same silver that Carver had coveted for years, the same hidden wealth that had motivated his attempts to steal their inheritance. Carver himself, his fortune destroyed along with his mansion, came to Cena with a proposal. He would provide mining equipment and expertise. They would split whatever profits resulted. He had connections, experience, resources that the sisters lacked. Together they could extract the silver and become wealthy beyond anything either could achieve alone. Cena considered the offer for 3 days. Then she refused. The mountain has given us enough, she told him quietly. Warmth, shelter, survival, everything my grandfather promised. I will not repay that gift by tearing the mountain apart for silver that we do not need. Instead, she sold the mining rights to a cooperative of local families, the same families whose members had sheltered in her cave house during the worst of the storm. The price was modest, but it was enough to fund the building school that Britt Svensson would establish the following year. The silver remained mostly in the ground, a hidden treasure that the mountain kept for itself. Some things Ysena understood were worth more than money. Jedediah Carver never rebuilt his ruined mansion. He lived out his remaining years in a modest cottage on the edge of town, a simple dwelling that Tobias helped him insulate using the techniques he had learned from Cena. His wife Constance, whose life had been saved in the cave house, became one of Cena's most dedicated students. She learned the old Norwegian building methods and taught them to her neighbors and eventually to her grandchildren. When Carver died in 1901, 8 years after the storm that had destroyed everything he once valued, his will contained a surprise that no one had expected. He left his remaining land holdings not to distant relatives who had never visited, but to a trust that would fund the education of orphan children in Silver Creek. Children like the Halverson sisters had once been. The trust was named in honor of Eric Halverson, the Norwegian immigrant whose wisdom had saved so many lives. Cena attended Carver's funeral on a cold January morning. She did not speak, but she stood at the graveside until all the other mourners had departed, remembering the man who had tried to destroy her and who had, in the end, been destroyed by his own arrogance and rebuilt, in some small measure, by her mercy. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year, as if the winter was reluctant to release its grip on the frozen land. But eventually the snow melted. The streams began to flow again. The world that had seemed dead came gradually back to life, green and growing, and full of promise for the future. Emma Crawford's parents were never found. When the spring thaw revealed the secrets the snow had hidden, many bodies were recovered from unexpected places. But Thomas and Mary Crawford had vanished completely, swallowed by the white chaos of the storm, leaving no trace of their final moments. Virgil, at 23, became both brother and parent to his 7-year-old sister. He brought Emma to live in a small cave house he built himself, following Cena's careful guidance, carved into a hillside 2 miles from the original. Emma grew up there, warm and safe through every winter, with a gray wolf dog puppy that Cena gave her on her 8th birthday. She named him Fenrir II. Years later, when Emma Crawford became the first woman elected to the Silver Creek Town Council, she told anyone who would listen that she owed her life to 2 things: a cave house that kept her warm when the world outside wanted to kill her, and an old wolf dog who taught her that even in the darkest moments, someone would always come to sit beside her and keep her company until the storm passed. On a warm afternoon in late May, Tobias asked Cena to walk with him. They climbed to the meadow above the cave house, the same meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom in carpets of purple and yellow and white. The peaks of the Rocky Mountains rose around them, still capped with snow that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Tobias was clearly nervous. His hands would not stay still. His eyes kept darting away and then back to Cena's face. He shifted his weight from foot to foot like an anxious boy, rather than a man who had faced the worst storm in memory without flinching. "I have been wanting to say something for a long time," he began, his voice uncertain in a way she had never heard before. Since the storm, since before the storm, honestly, if I am being truthful with myself. Sina waited, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. I came to you to learn how to build, Tobias continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. My mother was sick, dying in a cold cabin, and I needed knowledge that could save her. That was my only purpose at first. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes meeting hers without hesitation now. But I learned more than how to build walls and lay foundations. I learned what real courage looks like, what genuine determination means, what it takes to keep working when everyone around you says you should stop. He took her hand in both of his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I love you, Sina Halverson. I have loved you since the first day I walked into your cave house and felt the warmth. Not just the warmth from the fire, though that was remarkable enough. The warmth of who you are, the strength of your spirit, the fire in your heart. Sina looked at this man who had worked beside her through everything, who had ridden through the night to find a doctor when her sister lay injured, who had never asked for anything in return except the chance to learn and to help. She thought about her mother, who had loved her father despite his flaws and failures. She thought about her grandmother, who had crossed an ocean for the chance at something better. She thought about all the women who had come before her, who had loved and worked and survived against impossible odds. I love you too, she said simply. Tobias's face transformed with a joy that made him look years younger. Does that mean you will marry me? Sina smiled, feeling happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. Ask me properly, and we will find out. He dropped to one knee right there in the wildflower meadow, the mountain peaks rising behind him, the afternoon sun turning everything gold and warm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden ring, carved by his own hands, etched with traditional Norwegian patterns that he had copied from her grandfather's journal. Sina Halverson, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life building things with you, learning from you, standing beside you through whatever storms may come? Yes, she said, pulling him to his feet. Yes, I will. And the mountains seemed to echo her answer back across the valley. The wedding took place in October of 1893. It was a small ceremony held at the entrance to the cave house that had saved so many lives. Maren stood beside her sister as maid of honor, walking without her crutch now, her limp barely noticeable. Britt Svensson stood as witness, her strong face softened by emotion. Tobias's mother, Elena, finally healthy after months in the cave house her son had built for her, wept with joy throughout the service. Reverend Fletcher performed the ceremony at Sina's specific request. His voice was humble now, stripped of the arrogance that had once filled his sermons. He spoke of love, of partnership, of two people building something together that neither could build alone. When he pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer rose from the gathered crowd that echoed off the mountain peaks and seemed to reach all the way to the sky. They were no longer the cursed twins. They were simply Sina and Maren Halverson, women who had survived, women who had built, women who had proved that the old ways still had power and value in a world too eager to forget them. 40 years later, a journalist came to the mountains of Colorado. Her name was Margaret Winters. She worked for the Denver Post, and she was writing a series of articles about unusual homes scattered throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Houses built into hillsides, dwellings nestled in natural caves, structures that seemed to grow from the mountain itself rather than being imposed upon it. She had heard stories about a woman in Silver Creek who had started it all. She came to find Sina Halverson Reyes. Sina was 59 years old now. Her hair had turned completely gray, and her face was lined by decades of mountain weather, but her eyes remained sharp and clear. Her hands were still steady, still capable of the precise work she had done all her life. She welcomed the journalist into the cave house she had built more than 40 years ago. The same structure that still stood strong and warm, the same shelter that had saved 16 lives during the worst storm anyone could remember. Tell me, Margaret said, her pencil poised over her notebook, what gave you the strength to keep going? When everyone said you were wrong, when the whole world seemed to be against you, what made you persist? Sina was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. She looked at the framed page from her grandfather's journal that hung above the fireplace, the drawing he had made of a house inside a cave, the design that had guided everything she had built. I was never alone, she said finally. Even when I felt completely isolated, I was not truly alone. I had my grandfather's knowledge, preserved in his journal. I had my sister's support, her belief in what we were doing. I had people who came to learn instead of mock. She paused, remembering faces from long ago. When the town laughed at me, I had generations of ancestors standing at my side. When people told me I was foolish, I had centuries of tested wisdom telling me I was right. The knowledge was not mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had lived before me, everyone who had learned the same lessons through hard experience, everyone who had survived by building with the mountain instead of against it. She turned to look directly at the journalist, her eyes bright with conviction. The people who laugh at you are not your enemies. They are simply people who cannot yet see what you see. Your job is not to convince them with words. Your job is to build. Build what you believe in. Build it well. Build it carefully. And when it is finished, when it stands strong while everything else fails, they will finally see. Margaret wrote every word down. The article appeared in the Denver Post the following month. It was titled "The Woman Who Built into Mountains: How Ancient Wisdom Saved a Community." The response was overwhelming and immediate. Letters poured in from throughout Colorado and beyond. People wanted to learn the techniques. They wanted to visit Sina's home and see for themselves. They wanted to understand how knowledge from another century and another continent could still matter in the modern world. Sina answered every letter personally. She taught until her hands grew too stiff to demonstrate the techniques. She traveled to building sites throughout the Rocky Mountains, advising and correcting and encouraging. She trained a generation of builders who would train the next generation after them. Fenrir I had died in the spring following the Great Storm, passing peacefully in his accustomed spot near the fire, surrounded by the family he had protected through so many difficult years. They buried him behind the cave house, beneath a pine tree that Sina planted to mark the spot. The marker she carved herself read simply, "Fenrir, faithful friend, he kept us warm when the world outside was cold." Marin lived until 1951, becoming the first woman licensed as an architect in the state of Colorado. She designed homes throughout the Rocky Mountains, adapting her grandfather's principles to dozens of different sites and circumstances. She married Thomas Fletcher, the minister's eldest son, who had sheltered in the cave house as a boy, and they had 4 children who grew up learning the old ways. Britt Svensson founded a school that taught building skills to widowed women, giving them the knowledge and confidence to support themselves. She never remarried, saying once that she had been lucky enough to have one good husband and did not need another. But she was never lonely, surrounded always by students who became like daughters and granddaughters to her. And when Sina Halverson Reyes died in 1949, at the age of 77, she was buried beside her husband Tobias in the meadow above the cave house. The same meadow where he had proposed to her half a century before. The same meadow where wildflowers still bloomed every spring in carpets of purple and yellow and white. Her gravestone was simple, as she would have wanted. Sina Halverson Reyes, 1872 to 1949. She built not just with stone and wood, but with faith in those who came before her. Below those words, in smaller letters carved deep into the granite, was a phrase in the language of her ancestors. Fjelle glemmer ik. The mountain does not forget. The cave house still stands today. It has been maintained by the Reyes family for more than a century, each generation making repairs and improvements while preserving the essential design that Eric Halverson created so long ago. The stone fireplace still radiates heat through the coldest winter nights. The wooden walls still keep out the mountain winds. The cave itself still maintains its constant temperature, exactly as it did when Sina first stepped inside as a grieving 19-year-old girl. In 1978, the Colorado Historical Society designated it a protected landmark. Researchers came with modern scientific instruments, measuring temperatures and airflow and heat transfer with precision that Eric Halverson could never have imagined. They analyzed the principles behind the construction, comparing them to the most advanced techniques of contemporary building science. Their findings confirmed everything the old Norwegian immigrant had known instinctively. The cave house design was remarkably efficient, outperforming standard construction by a factor of 3 or more. The principles were identical to those being rediscovered by cutting-edge architects working on passive house designs and sustainable buildings. The same concepts that the most advanced researchers in the world were just beginning to understand had been applied by an immigrant craftsman more than a century earlier. The wisdom of ancestors, tested by time, validated by science, preserved by a young woman who simply refused to quit. If you are still watching this, remember what Sina Halvorson learned through her long and remarkable life. The people who mock you are not your enemies. They are simply people who cannot yet see what you can see. Your job is not to convince them with arguments or prove them wrong with words. Your job is to build. Build what you believe in. Build it carefully. Build it well. Build it with all the knowledge and determination and faith you can summon. And when it is finished, when it stands strong and true while everything around it fails, they will finally see what you saw all along. The mountain does not care who laughs at you. The mountain only cares who survives. And if you build with wisdom, if you build with patience, if you build with the accumulated knowledge of everyone who struggled and learned before you, you will survive. You will more than survive. You will thrive. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched something in you, if it gave you hope when you needed it, if it reminded you that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through determination and faith, please share it with someone else who needs to hear it. And remember, the next time someone tells you that your dream is impossible, that you are foolish, that you should give up and accept defeat, remember Sina. Remember the cave house. Remember that the people who laugh today may be knocking on your door tomorrow, asking for the shelter you refuse to stop building. Build anyway. The mountain is waiting, and it has been waiting for you for a very long time.